Humans have a very familiar habit: when we don't understand something, we label it nonsense. Ancient tales, strange records, stories passed down by people long gone. All of it gets easily dismissed as fiction, superstition, or wild imagination. History doesn't argue. It waits. Hundreds, sometimes thousands of years pass, until a shovel hits the ground, a shipwreck is lifted from the ocean floor, or a bone lying where it shouldn't be is examined with new eyes. And then history does what it does best. It proves that the thing once laughed at was actually real. Story 1. The most misunderstood assassin group in history. In games and movies, the Hashashin are usually portrayed as drugged-out killers, red eyes, parkour everywhere, whispering edgy one-liners. It works for video games. Real history, though, it's way more unsettling. The Hashashin were a real group in the Middle Ages, and the English word assassin comes directly from their name. Not Hollywood, not lazy screenwriters, actual history. Here's the part that keeps people up at night. They weren't high. The whole Hash story was most likely enemy propaganda, a convenient way to call them insane so they'd seem less terrifying. The real Hashashin were calm, disciplined, patient. They could blend in for years, build trust, then strike in broad daylight in front of witnesses. They weren't scary because they lost control. They were scary because they were completely sober when they decided you were done. Story: 2 unicorns are real and they're not cute. When you hear the word unicorn, you probably imagine a spotless white horse, sparkly mane, stepping out of a fairy tale to help you believe in love and buy more scented candles. A creature that looks like it does yoga, eats clean, and gives emotional support speeches. Then history shows up and says, no, stop. Real-life unicorns were massive, shaggy, rhinoceros-like beasts, weighing several tons with a single giant horn and the attitude of something that absolutely does not care about your feelings. They didn't move gracefully. They charged fast with intent. No rainbows, no glowing light, just thick fur, raw muscle, and a horn that looked like it was designed to solve all conflicts through violence. No one wanted to ride it. No one wanted to hug it. And absolutely no one wanted a cute selfie with it. Turns out unicorns did exist. They just weren't made for the faint of heart. Story 3. The Kraken isn't a monster, it's just too big. Back in the 1600s, if a sailor ran ashore screaming that he'd seen a sea monster, tentacles as thick as masts, eyes the size of wagon wheels dragging ships under the waves, people would nod and say, yeah, he's been drinking. Fair assumption. Sailors back then were famous for rum sleep deprivation and imaginations that traveled farther than their maps. Except for one problem. They weren't lying. In the real world, giant squids exist. They're so massive that if one surfaced beside your ship in dim lantern light, your brain would instantly choose the safest explanation. Monster, definitely a monster. No magic, no curses. Just an absurdly large sea creature that lives very deep and does not care whether you believe in it or not. Honestly, if you had seen that thing in 1600, you'd have gone home and told the exact same story too. Story 4. Sea serpents and oarfish when the truth is just too long. In old ship logs, the sea serpent was described in loving detail, an endlessly long body twisting across the surface like the ocean had accidentally swallowed a dragon. And when sailors told the story, the usual response was, yeah, rum again. Then science showed up and said, hold on. In the real world, there's the oarfish, a creature as long as a nightmare, thin like a ribbon, and fully capable of surfacing at the exact moment you're tired, hungry, and severely sleep-deprived. It's not aggressive. It doesn't chase ships. It just, appears, exists, and disappears again without asking permission. Seen from a distance in fog with waves and panic. Yeah, that looks exactly like a sea serpent. The truth isn't any less strange than the legend. It's just less dramatic and long in a very unnecessary way. Story 5. Amazons aren't a fairy tale, they were just terrifying. For centuries, people assumed the Amazons, horse-riding women. Master archers, full-time warriors, were pure Greek imagination. As in, yeah, sure, guys travel far, come back, exaggerate. Then archaeology showed up and said, no, they were telling the truth. Researchers uncovered graves of women buried with weapons, armor, and clear signs of combat. Not props, not ritual symbols, This was a professional resume. Turns out the Amazons weren't a fairy tale. They were real women who lived real lives and fought real battles in societies where women didn't ask permission to exist. The Greeks didn't invent the story. They just panicked when they encountered women who didn't wait to be rescued, but rode in on horseback to solve the problem themselves. And honestly, if you were a man in the ancient world, you'd probably call that a myth too, just to sleep better at night. Story 6, Troy when poetry is forced to tell the truth. For centuries, the Iliad was treated like ancient entertainment. Epic wars, handsome heroes, gods showing up uninvited. Fun to read, but don't take it too seriously. And the city of Troy, that sounded more like a movie setting than a real place you could pin on a map. Then one guy said, "Wait, what if it's real?" And instead of writing a 40-page rebuttal, he chose a simpler method. He grabbed a shovel and started digging. People laughed, academics sighed. Classic reaction to another over-enthusiastic poetry fan. Until stone, then walls, then foundations. Then an entire ancient city sitting right there under the dirt. Turns out Troy wasn't a metaphor for war. Not poetic exaggeration, not literary magic. Just a real city buried long enough that everyone assumed it was fake. When poetry comes with stone foundations, history is left with only one response. Yeah, sorry we doubted you. Story 7. Atlantis when a legend is collective PTSD. When Plato talked about Atlantis, humanity mostly shrugged. Yeah, philosopher stuff, fancy metaphors. A rich advanced civilization and then boom, gone, swallowed by the sea. Sounds more like a movie trailer than history. Then science stepped in very politely and pointed at the Aegean Sea. Near Santorini, there was a volcanic eruption, so massive it could erase an entire coastal civilization in a matter of moments. Tsunamis, ash clouds, cities wiped off the map. No gods required, no magic spells, just geology. Suddenly, Atlantis doesn't sound made up anymore. It sounds like a collective memory retold across generations each time with a little extra drama to make sure no one forgets. Plato may not have drawn an accurate map, but he might have been recording a very real disaster. The ancient version of everything disappeared in a single day. Story 8. The pyramids are still keeping secrets. Everyone thinks the pyramids were figured out a long time ago. Tourists climbed them, textbooks mapped them, the internet argued about everything from hidden treasure to aliens pulling night shifts. So yeah, everyone felt confident. No more surprises. The pyramids probably just sighed. Then humans showed up with a new toy. Muon scanning, basically using cosmic particles from outer space to X-ray the inside of the Great Pyramid of Giza. Sounds very scientific, very modern, very okay this time we know everything. And the result? Massive empty spaces that had never been documented before. No piles of gold, no deadly traps, just the pyramid calmly saying, yeah, there's more. After 400 or 500 years, it's still holding cards back. Not because humans are stupid, but because the pyramid never intended to tell the whole story. Story 9. The Egyptian city that sank into the sea. For centuries, ancient texts mentioned a prosperous Egyptian city off the Mediterranean coast, and everyone treated it like pure imagination. As in, sure, people back then exaggerated. What city just disappears that cleanly? Temples, busy harbors, ships everywhere, and then poof gone. Sounds like a movie plot, not history. Then science showed up with scuba gear and a very serious attitude. At the bottom of the Mediterranean Sea, researchers found Heracleion, a real city. Massive stone columns, statues weighing tons, harbors, streets, all sitting quietly underwater like they just overslept. No magic, no ancient curse, just earthquakes subsiding land and the sea doing exactly what the sea does. Turns out history never vanished. It just went underwater to get some peace and quiet. And honestly, if your entire city sank into the ocean, you'd also hope future generations would stop calling it a legend. Story 10. Vikings reached America before Columbus. For centuries, Viking sagas about sailing west to a strange new land were treated like group bragging. As in, yeah, right, these guys exaggerate, drink enough mead, and suddenly there's a new continent. America before Christopher Columbus. Sounds a bit ambitious for wooden ships. Then archaeology did the most annoying thing possible to skepticism. It brought receipts. At Lens, Meadows researchers found Viking house foundations, iron nails, and clear signs of daily life. Not souvenirs, not props, actual homes. And just like that, the story flipped. Columbus didn't discover America. He just arrived later, much later, and marketed it better. The Vikings didn't write reports. They didn't apply for funding. They showed up, stayed a while, then left like, yeah, it's fine, just really cold. History didn't change. The spotlight just switched to a different person standing under it. Story 11: El Dorado wasn't a city. When the Spanish heard about El Dorado, they immediately pictured a city made entirely of gold. Golden streets, golden walls, probably golden dogs. So they lost their minds marching through jungles over mountains, dying along the way, in search of a very greedy version of Google Maps. The truth, however, was far less shiny. El Dorado wasn't a place. It was a person. A local leader who took part in a ritual covered in gold dust before stepping into a sacred lake. No palaces, no endless treasure vaults. Just gold, sprinkled on a human for ceremonial vibes. Europeans heard this and said, yeah, there must be more. So they added the rest themselves: cities, temples, infinite riches. When imagination runs faster than reality, people don't find what they're looking for. But they're very good at making everything worse. El Dorado never disappeared. It was just exaggerated until no one could recognize what it originally was. Story 12: The Lost City in the Jungle. For years, the White City was lumped in with stories that start like, my friend has an uncle who totally saw it. A gleaming white city hidden in the jungles of Central America, great campfire material. Not exactly textbook ready. Then humans decided to stop guessing. They brought in LIDAR laser scanning from the air, cutting through dense jungle canopy like turning on cheat mode in a video game. And guess what? Beneath the trees in Honduras, roads appeared. Plazas, structures, clear signs of La Ciudad Blanca. Not hallucination, not collective imagination. Real architecture. Turns out the jungle never swallowed history. It just covered it patiently until humans had the technology to see through the leaves. The White City never vanished. It just stood there silent, letting humanity argue about it for a few hundred years for fun. Story 13. The fossil ignored for 80 years. Science likes to think it's perfectly objective. Data is king. Truth above all. No emotions, no bias. Sounds great. Then a fossil showed up and science said, that doesn't make sense, ignore it. For decades, fossil evidence linked to the coelacanth was pushed aside because it didn't fit what textbooks already believed. A fish thought to have gone extinct tens of millions of years ago. No, impossible, please don't ruin the script. So the discovery sat there ignored for nearly 80 years. Not because the evidence was weak, but because it made people uncomfortable. Then one day the fish showed up in real life. Alive, swimming, completely normal. Basically saying, where did you think I went? Turns out science is still done by humans. And humans are very good at ignoring things that don't fit their existing beliefs. The truth doesn't need immediate belief. It just needs enough patience to wait. Story 14. The ancient map that got laughed at. When an ancient map resurfaced, the modern reaction was laughter. Coastlines looked weird, proportions felt off. Some parts looked like Earth drawn by a tired kid after 2 cups of coffee. Quick verdict. Random scribbles. Then someone did the most dangerous thing in science. They compared it seriously. The old map went side by side with modern data. Satellites, measurements, math. And suddenly, the laughing got quieter. Some coastlines matched. Some details lined up in ways that felt uncomfortable. Not perfect, but accurate enough to make people clear their throats and change the subject. Turns out the map wasn't wrong. It was drawn with knowledge from a different era using different tools in a different language of understanding. Mocking the past is easy. Admitting we underestimated it, that's much harder. History doesn't need us to believe immediately. It just needs us to stop laughing so fast. Story 15. The disaster once called superstition. Across many cultures, ancient people told stories of terrifying disasters, the ground shaking, the sea turning violent, the sky going dark, entire cities vanishing overnight. Later generations usually nodded and said, yeah, superstition. Sounds more like campfire stories than serious science. Then science arrived. Late. Centuries later, researchers found fault lines, layers of volcanic ash, and tsunami deposits. And suddenly, those wild legends started sounding very familiar. The only difference, this time there were numbers, graphs, and 40-page reports. Ancient people didn't have instruments, no satellites, no laboratories. They had collective memory and a survival instinct. Remember what happened so it doesn't happen again. Turns out they weren't stupid. They were just telling the truth in the language of their time. And if you survive a disaster like that, your descendants will probably call it a legend too. Story 16. The 2000-year-old Greek computer. At first, it looked like nothing more than a lump of rusted metal pulled up from the seafloor. No blinking lights, no screen, no buttons. Humanity collectively went, yeah, probably ancient decoration. Then someone did something bold. They ran it through a CT scan, and suddenly the rusty lump started talking. Inside were gears, a lot of gears, perfectly meshed, so precise and complex that modern engineers squinted at it and muttered, wait, this shouldn't exist. Turns out the ancient Greeks built a mechanical computer to predict solar eclipses, lunar eclipses, and planetary motion. 2,000 years ago. No electricity, no Wi-Fi, no software updates. The history of technology sat up a little straighter. Ancient humans weren't slow. We just forgot how good they actually were. And honestly, if that thing had a battery, it would probably run smoother than a few apps we use today. Story 17. Stone Age skull drilling. When modern people hear Stone Age skull drilling, the instinctive reaction is, that's not medicine, that's murder. No anesthesia, no antibiotics, no instruction manual. Just hearing it makes you want to run. Then archaeology ruins that conclusion. Researchers found skulls with cleanly drilled holes and clear signs of bone healing, which means the patient didn't just survive, they lived long enough for the body to recover. Hard to believe, but the evidence is right there. Stone Age people didn't drill skulls for fun. They did it to relieve pain, treat head injuries, or drive bad things out of the mind. Sounds superstitious, but sometimes it actually worked. Not barbaric, not pointless risk-taking, just medicine, the version not meant for the faint of heart. Ancient humans weren't stupid. They were just far braver or far more reckless than we are today. And if you survived that procedure, you'd never be afraid of the dentist again. Story 18. Archimedes' light weapon. When people hear that Archimedes supposedly used sunlight to burn Roman warships, the modern reaction is pretty predictable. Okay, where's the Marvel movie? Death rays made of mirrors just missing a flying metal suit, and we've got a superhero origin story. For centuries, this tale lived comfortably in the fun-to-hear, don't-take-seriously drawer. Then science did its favorite annoying thing. It tested it properly. Modern experiments used large mirrors, carefully aligned right angles, right distances, right sunlight. And the result? It can happen. Not easily, not quickly, not cinematically. But under perfect conditions, wood can catch fire. The catch is what perfect conditions mean. Blazing sun, a stationary ship, and an enemy kind enough to stand still and wait to be burned. So yes, Archimedes could have been right. Reality just isn't as cool as the legend. The light weapon wasn't impossible. It was just extremely picky about the situation. Story 19. The Mad Emperor and the Floating Yachts. When historians talk about Caligula, there's usually an invisible footnote, possibly exaggerated. Too insane, too extravagant, too ridiculous to be real. Giant pleasure ships on a lake. Marble floors, hot water plumbing. Sounds like slander written by haters. Then archaeology showed up and ruined the skepticism. At the bottom of Lake Nemi, researchers found 2 actual ships. Very real, very large, very luxurious. With engineering so advanced, modern engineers raised an eyebrow. Gears, anchoring systems, water pipes. This wasn't a ship. This was a Roman floating resort. Turns out Caligula wasn't exaggerated. He just had unlimited power and a very specific sense of taste. The problem wasn't that he was crazy. The problem was that he was crazy and had brilliant engineers to make his ideas real. When madness meets technical skill, history doesn't call it innovation. It calls it a disaster with a budget. Story 20. Roman female gladiators. For centuries, the idea of female Roman gladiators was treated like fantasy, as in, the arena is for muscular men only. It sounds logical, it sounds familiar, and it's wrong. Then archaeology stepped in and wrecked the script. Researchers uncovered graves reliefs and written records showing women who carried weapons, wore armor, and stepped into the arena just like any other gladiator. Not as decoration, not as background. They fought for real, they got injured for real, and sometimes they won for real. Turns out the arena wasn't a closed club. It was open to anyone brave enough to step inside and survive. The Romans didn't make it up. We just got used to viewing the past through a modern filter. And if you were a spectator back then, you wouldn't remember them for their gender. You'd remember them because they walked out to face something everyone else only dared to watch. History isn't lacking strong women. They were just overlooked. Story 21. Real-life killer whales. A lot of people read Moby Dick and assume it's just literary exaggeration. A white whale seeking revenge on humans sounds more like a Hollywood script than real history. But in real life, there was Mocha Dick, a real whale in the Pacific famous for attacking and sinking whaling ships. Not once, many times. There were witnesses, reports, survivors who lived long enough to tell the story still shaken. Mocha Dick didn't have a grand philosophy. It was just enormous, highly intelligent, and extremely uninterested in being messed with. When nature reaches a certain size, it doesn't need malice to become terrifying. It just needs to react to what humans do. Turns out Moby Dick wasn't completely made up. Humans are just used to thinking they're always the hunters. Every now and then, history reminds us, sometimes you're the prey. Story 22. Pirate treasure is real. Movies make us believe pirates buried gold under palm trees, drew an X on a map, and vanished poetically. It sounds romantic, it's convenient for a script, and it's almost entirely wrong. In real life, pirates did have treasure. They just didn't bury it and forget about it. Stolen money was usually split immediately, spent immediately, and converted into rum guns and a long list of terrible financial decisions. Pirates were not long-term investors. They were very much a spend-it-while-you-have-it crowd. Sometimes gold was buried, but for extremely mundane reasons. The ship was about to be captured, there wasn't time to carry it, or someone thought, I'll leave it here for now and come back later. And then never came back. So pirate treasure exists, but it's rare, messy, and deeply unromantic. No elegant maps, no clever riddles. Just money lost because the people who owned it lived fast and died even faster. Turns out the problem isn't that pirate treasure doesn't exist. It's that movies made it way too pretty. Story 23. Hollywood pirate bloodlines. When someone says they're descended from pirates, the usual reaction is, yeah, sure, fun family lore. Something you say at a party, not something people take seriously. Then DNA testing showed up and said, hold on. Some family trees people joked about turned out to be real. Actual pirate descendants, historical records, genetic evidence. No cutlasses, no skull flags, just DNA quietly passed down generation after generation. That doesn't mean you're born wanting to raid ships, but studies suggest history can pass on tendencies, more risk-taking, more comfort with uncertainty, less patience for safe, boring paths. Turns out Hollywood wasn't completely lying. Some people really do have pirate blood. The difference is, today they don't raid ships at sea. They raid opportunities, deadlines, and cafe Wi-Fi. History doesn't disappear. It just changes roles. Story 24. A dynasty in a pharmacy. For centuries, some East Asian pharmacies sold something called dragon bones. Sounds like a rare herbal remedy. In reality, they were ancient bones, and not just any bones with writing carved into them. Customers ground them into powder, mixed them with water, and drank them to treat all kinds of illnesses. Sellers thought it was simple, bone is bone. If it works, it works. No one stopped to ask, wait, why do these bones have writing on them? Then one day, scholars read the symbols, and suddenly everyone got a little nervous. They were ancient Chinese characters, records of rituals, kings' wars. An entire dynasty was being sold, by the gram. History, power, and politics nearly got crushed, mixed with warm water, and swallowed after dinner. Turns out history isn't always burned, buried, or destroyed. Sometimes it's just unlucky enough to end up on a pharmacy shelf. And if you've ever taken a traditional remedy, there's a small chance you've tasted history without even knowing it. Story 25. The historian called a liar. For centuries, Herodotus carried a pretty brutal nickname, the father of made-up stories. He wrote about strange cities, hard-to-believe customs, and events that sounded like they'd been exaggerated for fun. Scholars read it and sighed, entertaining sure, but probably not real. Then archaeology started digging, and it hit. Real cities, real customs, and yes, the weird events were real too. Layer by layer, the dirt came off, and suddenly Herodotus's wild tales became very hard to dismiss. He wasn't making things up. He was just recording a world that really was that strange. The problem wasn't Herodotus. The problem is that the truth often sounds too ridiculous to believe right away. Turns out he wasn't a liar. He was just telling the story a few thousand years before science caught up. And honestly, if you accurately describe everything you see, people would probably accuse you of lying too. Story 26. The Ghost Army Underground. In war, there are reports that sound like severe sleep deprivation. Soldiers vanish, then reappear behind you, noises under your feet, traps where you just walked. The standard response from command is predictable. Paranoia, get some rest. Then reality knocks, with a shovel. Beneath the ground were real tunnels, a vast underground network with air vent storage rooms, field hospitals, and kitchens that produced no smoke. No magic, no invisibility. Just humans patiently digging, thinking a few steps ahead of the enemy. Modern technology looked down and asked, how did we miss this? The answer was simple, because it wasn't thinking like the people living underneath. Turns out the ghost army wasn't made of ghosts. They were just operating somewhere you refused to look. Technology is powerful, that's true, but it often loses to something very old-fashioned. Terrain, time, and humans so determined they're willing to live underground. Sometimes the way to win isn't upgrading higher. It's going lower than your enemy ever imagines. Story 27. The city destroyed by fire from the sky. In ancient texts, there are stories that sound deeply religious: fire raining from the heavens, a city vaporized everything, ending on one very bad day. Later generations read that and usually conclude metaphor. Then science steps in and says, wait. Researchers uncovered evidence of a meteor impact. Melted Earth, extreme pressure temperatures high enough to turn sand into glass in seconds. No angry gods required, just a space rock on a terrible schedule. The problem is, ancient people didn't have the word meteor. No laboratories, no scientific papers. They had eyewitnesses, a blinding sky, and a city that disappeared. So they told the story using the only language they had. Fire from the sky. Turns out the witnesses weren't lying. They just didn't know what to call the thing that destroyed everything. And if you lived back then, you'd probably call it a miracle too. Just a very unfriendly one. Story 28. The Children Who Vanished in Hamelin. The story of Hamelin is usually told with a magic flute and children disappearing like it's a cartoon scene. Everyone hears it and quickly decides fairy tale. History, unfortunately, isn't that cheerful. There's no evidence of a magic flute, no spells, no supernatural explanation. But there are real records from the 13th century stating that a group of children left the town and never came back. No clear reason, no ending, just gone. The theories go everywhere, migration, disease, accidents, being taken to settle elsewhere. The problem is, none of them are certain. So the story has been hanging there for centuries. History doesn't always give neat answers. Sometimes it just leaves behind a deeply uncomfortable gap. No magic flute, just real children who disappeared and a mystery that still refuses to explain itself. Story 29. The discovery that almost got thrown away. At first, the object looked like literal trash. Broken, caked in mud, no label, no protection. The natural human instinct kicked in. Trash it, move on. History almost ended right there thanks to an overly enthusiastic cleanup. Then one person stopped. Not because of genius, just slightly excessive curiosity. The kind that goes, wait, why does this look weird? So the trash was kept, cleaned, looked at more closely. Surprise! It was history, a rare artifact, a crucial piece of evidence. The kind textbooks would love if it hadn't almost been tossed first. Turns out the past isn't always preserved in brightly lit museums. Sometimes it's sitting in a messy pile waiting for someone not to be too eager to throw things away. Luck, it turns out, is also a form of science. And sometimes history is saved not by brilliance, but by someone who's just a little bad at getting rid of stuff. Story 30. The truth that split science. Some discoveries aren't shocking because they're insane, but because they refuse to sit still. The data is there, the evidence is there, the conclusion not yet. So science does the most scientific thing possible. It splits. One side says it's obvious. The other says not enough. Both have charts, both have jargon, both have papers long enough to make outsiders nod politely and pretend they understand. Meanwhile, the truth stands in the middle, arms crossed like it's waiting for humanity to make up its mind before stepping forward. Science isn't always a clean line of answers. Sometimes it's a decades-long argument where every side has very reasonable reasons to not back down. And for the rest of us watching from the middle, there's only one thing that's certain. If science is still arguing, no one has won yet. The truth hasn't disappeared. It just prefers to be debated a little longer before showing its face. Story 31. When humans once laughed at history itself. For hundreds of years, there was one kind of source scholars consistently dismissed. Not because it was wrong, but because it was too ordinary. Oral stories, diaries of common people, fishermen's accounts, fragmented notes from monks, merchants, farmers. They were labeled unscientific, unstructured, unreliable. Then modern science did something uncomfortable. It compared those stories with real-world data, and the results made people uneasy. Droughts, once dismissed as divine punishment, lined up perfectly with climate cycles. Monsters reported by coastal villages turned out to be real species, just not yet classified. Ominous signs before disasters matched geological warning signals. Not because ancient people understood science, but because they observed carefully. This story isn't saying every legend is true. It's saying something simpler and harder to accept. Mockery is the fastest way to miss the truth. After 31 stories, history isn't asking us to believe everything. It's asking for something more humble. Don't rush to assume you already know it all. Ancient people didn't live in darkness, they simply saw the world through different tools. Modern humans, even with telescopes, satellites, and AI, still repeat the same old mistake. If we don't understand something yet, we assume it must be wrong. History doesn't argue with us, it doesn't try to prove a point. It just waits quietly until we're patient enough to listen. And maybe right now we're still living in the middle of stories that simply haven't been believed yet.